We often contemplate superintelligent entities, and advances in AI and human mind augmentation may soon bring them about. But how big could they get? What would they think about? And might you, or I, one day become one ourselves? A fairly common theme in both science fiction and futurism is trying to push the envelope to imagine the biggest possible example of something, or most extreme version, and the big difference between science fiction and futurism is that the latter does expect you to present some solid reasoning and scientific support for the case. Today we're looking at the biggest possible computers or minds you could build, and one of the big questions that comes up with megaminds is what they spend all their time thinking about. Amusingly, it might be dreaming up even huger minds than themselves, and with all their brains, they ought to be able to come up with some ideas that chuckle at the ones we'll discuss today. My own first exposure to the topic of truly immense computers was Douglas Adams' Deep Thought in the first book of his famous 5-book trilogy, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. This was an immense computer built by higher dimensional beings, Fook and Lunkwil, and on being turned on and making some initial discussion and calibration, Fook begins. "Oh, Deep Thought computer," he said, "the task we have designed you to perform is this. We want you to tell us," he paused, "the answer." "The answer," said Deep Thought. "The answer to what?" "Life," urged Fook. "The universe," said Lunkwil. "Everything," they said in chorus. Deep Thought paused for a moment's reflection. "Tricky," he said, finally. "But can you do it?" Again, a significant pause. "Yes," said Deep Thought, "I can do it." "There is an answer?" said Fook with breathless excitement. "Yes," said Deep Thought. "Life, the universe, and everything. There is an answer. But I'll have to think about it." Fook glanced impatiently at his watch. "How long?" he said. 7.5 million years, said Deep Thought. Lunkwell and Fook blinked at each other. 7.5 million years, they cried in chorus. "Yes," declaimed Deep Thought. "I said I would have to think about it, didn't I?" When the descendants of Fook and Lunkwell arrive on the day of revelation, Deep Thought tells them that it does indeed have an answer, but they are not going to like it. They say it doesn't matter, and they must know it, and now. "Now?" inquired Deep Thought. "Yes, now!" "All right," said the computer, and settled into silence again. The two men fidgeted. The tension was unbearable. "You're really not going to like it," observed Deep Thought. "Tell us!" "All right," said Deep Thought. "The answer to the great question." "Yes?" "Of life, the universe, and everything," said Deep Thought. "Yes?" "Is," said Deep Thought, and paused. "Yes?" "Is." "Yes?" 42, said Deep Thought, with infinite majesty and calm. That, for those who didn't know, is the origin of the various jokes about the number 42, my lucky number, which is also on the t-shirt I'm wearing as I write, this along with a whale and a flower pot that my wife got me for my 42nd birthday. Deep Thought goes on to explain they hadn't really been clear on the question, that big question of life, the universe, and everything, and they couldn't actually tell them the question either, but it could help them design a far bigger and better computer that would be able to give them the question that 42 was the answer for. It would be so big, though, that it would be the size of a planet, and even incorporating living creatures into its processing. They get in contact with the planet Magrathea, which builds entire luxury custom-to-order planets for incredibly wealthy people, and commission this computer planet, which was named the Earth. Magrathea makes such incredible works in general that they bankrupt the galaxy filling orders and go to sleep for eons till the economy recovers enough to once again pay for their services, and when our protagonists arrive at the planet, its automated defenses fire some missiles at them, which for highly improbable reasons end up turning into a large sperm whale and a pot of flowers. Douglas Adams had a knack for using humor and absurdity to explore ideas, and that book is rightly famous for its explorations and deconstruction of so many concepts in science and sci-fi, though in this case the one worth highlighting for later discussion is the idea that they were passing along the work of deep philosophy and finding a purpose to life, to a giant computer and it likewise did the same, they both passed the buck or kicked it up the food chain. And when contemplating super big computers, this tends to be the most common suggested purpose for them. And on a whim, I asked ChatGPT just now for the answer, and its two-paragraph explanation was evasive, but the last quarter of the text is actually a reference to Douglas Adams, which speaks to how impactful that series was. The next place I came across it was in my namesake's work, Isaac Asimov, and he is famous for his robot novels and stories, but another recurring parallel storyline he had was Multivac, an enormous computer that shows up in many of his works, often unrelated beyond the name, which was styled on Univac, an early supercomputer mainframe he had incorrectly assumed was named for having a single vacuum tube. So Uni became Multi, which was really an acronym for Universal Automatic Computer, nothing to do with one or vacuum tubes. But Univac 1 was bought by the US Census Bureau in 1951, and it and its siblings were huge and inspired a lot of discussion of future bigger computers that might take up whole buildings or even cities. Asimov even proposes ones that spill over entire planetary surfaces or merge into hyperspace to find more room for components and permit faster signal travel. And in perhaps his most famous short story, The Last Question, we see its operators ask the early version of the question of if it's possible to find some way to stop or reverse entropy. Multivac responds in big godlike all caps, "Insufficient data for meaningful answer." And we jump forward in time to an even bigger upgraded incarnation of Multivac and a more advanced humanity, and someone asks the same question and it replies, again in all caps, "There is as yet insufficient data for a meaningful answer." And we skip ahead again and again to humanity growing through the galaxy and beyond, and folks asking ever bigger versions of this computer the same question and getting that same answer. Ultimately, a truly advanced and ascended man, being something of a group hive mind of all remaining humans, looks upon a universe finally falling to entropy, with stars dying out, asks that same question and gets the same answer, and wistfully merges itself into the computer, which is now principally in hyperspace, so that it can survive the end of the universe in some form. Those of you who tuned in to our July episode on the Fermi Paradox and the fine-tuned universe theory might recall me riffing on that all-caps answer during the episode. The story ends on a hopeful note, with the computer cogitating now that it has all the data it needs, in a dark universe at the end of time, and eventually coming up with a solution, declaring, "Let there be light," and spawning a new Big Bang, implying it had a right to those godlike all-caps responses. One of Asimov's lesser-known stories, The Last Answer, also plays with this sort of ultimate computer, where an interstellar civilization, and this was written before the internet, wires all its computers together through hyperspace to make one powerful enough to ask it the big question of if there is a god. And it zaps someone who realizes there's a problem and tries to unplug it, and declares, "Yes, now there is a god." This is two of our first points for discussion today, now that we have set the sci-fi stage, and one is that we envision building big computers to ask them tough questions, which is a bit backwards from what we usually do, which is to build a big computer to help it do our math while we ask and solve the problem ourselves. That to me has always been a critical difference, and while I cheerfully use ChatGPT these days myself, I use it basically like Google or for asking questions to see what other folks have brought up. So if I'm talking about Martian domes, I might ask it for a list of 10 common problems they might have, and it will list them off. And I already have 8 of those, there will be a 9th I forgot of, a 10th that's utter nonsense, and one of those 8 might be from a perspective I hadn't really thought of. It's a handy sounding board, and I like that term as in this case you really are just bouncing ideas off of it. It isn't capable of any. But the notion in sci-fi is that it is and better than us, and that could be true in the future. So it raises the idea that we could really ask it to solve problems, and the legitimate worry that maybe we should not be, that we should be solving them ourselves. That's not something we can say confidently either way yet. I think there is as yet insufficient data for a meaningful answer, but it is the most common reason suggested for building truly huge computers, in sci-fi and speculation anyway. In practice, it's for shuffling truly impressive hordes of data, like the Census Bureau back in the day, much as writing was invented for keeping boring tax records and accounts, long before it got used for storytelling and teaching. The other notion is that it highlighted the idea that we could just build bigger and bigger, which disappeared for a while in the 80s and 90s as Moore's law reigned as king, as we instead imagined ever more compact computers. But we see the return of big computers after that, and real scientific speculation about how big you can go with the ideas of the Jupiter brain and Matrioshka brain in the 1990s. So what exactly is a Jupiter brain? It came in futurism discussion about the same time as the Matrioshka brain suggested by Ray Bradbury, late in the 20th century, which we'll also be discussing today, and the name and concept gets credited to Keith Henson, the founder of the L5 Society, which merged with the National Space Institute to form the National Space Society that I currently have the honor of being president of. And Keith had suggested the idea of using machines to turn something of Jupiter's mass into a single huge computer able to run an uploaded and massively upgraded version of his own mind. Needless to say, it would be stunningly powerful, but how stunning depends on the computronium it was built from. Computronium is our general catch-all term for matter devoted entirely to computation, and as best as you can make it. It's a hypothetical substance that is maximally efficient at performing computations, and is closely associated with discussions in advanced computing and nanotechnology, where atoms and molecules can be engineered to function as nanoscale computing devices, and maybe even below that scale to femtotech levels, the subatomic. The usual notion is that if you can build a computer or mind that big, then it can rapidly solve to make itself more efficient if it wasn't already maxed out, which is a bit of a hand wave but not a terribly unreasonable one. As I mentioned, science fiction generally does horrible with contemplating how a bigger, smarter, or more enlightened mind will act, and futurism is usually a bit better, but obviously it's hard to have intelligent conversations about the behavior of something vastly smarter than yourself, and even ignoring that, the topic does tend to attract a lot of woo, even from serious science and futurist speculation. Our goal today is to try to wade through some of the muck and hopefully not make more of it ourselves. But a key point is that both the Jupiter brain, or J brain, and Matrioshka brain, or M brain, are called brains, not computers, and in the former case, it's specifically because Henson's using it as an example of an expanded human brain, not some general-purpose calculator or an AI, though it could obviously fill that role. I mentioned earlier that Asimov suggested using hyperspace as a way to get around signal lag limitations, and this is a good point to raise too. One big advantage smaller computers have is they pack way more transistors into a smaller space, not just adding more in, but cutting down the time it takes for operations to occur between them. To give an idea here, the human brain has around 100 billion neurons that are beautifully packed into the small space of our brain and three-dimensionally, and runs on about 10 watts of power. It still roughly matches the best supercomputers currently being turned out, which fill whole rooms and run on megawatts. That's another key issue for later, how much energy you have to spend to flip each proverbial computer switch, and how you get rid of all that heat, when heat dissipation is mostly a function of size. Some super tiny computer can't really get rid of all the heat it produces when it flips switches, and under classical computing, the hotter you are, the more energy it takes to flip a switch, or do a computation, or produce a unit of thought. The bigger your computers get, or brain full of neurons, the more spacing is between the average switch or neuron, and the longer the typical computation is taking, all things being equal. A circuit board 10 times as big is able to pack 10 squared as many circuits in, 100, but the individual communication takes 10 times longer, so you gain in scale but lose in speed as you build bigger. But back to our brain. It does not move at light speed, indeed it moves at less than the speed of sound, which is roughly 1,000,000 times slower. If you could emulate a single neuron with a small computer or chip, which was then connected by wires to its 100 billion siblings spread out to emulate that whole brain, then we would have to spread it out over a volume roughly the size of Earth itself to result in that same signal lag, a literal planet brain that had the same capacity and speed as a human mind, and something like that could conceivably evolve naturally too, although probably more two-dimensionally on the planet's surface. And we might, for fun, imagine that as 100 billion alien trees, since neurons look so like a tree, root and branch, that they derive their dendritic terminology from them. However, we could also imagine a planet-sized brain that was not 100 billion tiny chips scattered over such a huge volume, but untold quintillions, or a human-sized brain that simply had light-speed communication, not speed of sound. A basic concept of transhumanism is to replace all a person's neurons, or the connections between them, with some superconducting wire that just speeds everything up a millionfold, and you would instantly think at least a million times faster, experiencing years for every minute that passed in the real world. This is called speed superintelligence, and this approach tends to be a core concept in a lot of discussion of both transhumanism and technological singularities. And as I said in our episode on that topic, is a technological singularity inevitable? From a practical perspective, this would not actually work. One-for-one replacement of your brain with faster bits. At best, it is leaving you some gibbering ruin of a person, experiencing a dragged-out second in which they could exist and think and contemplate for years of subjective time, even before they finished their first scream. All while collapsing to the floor in terror of knowing that even if they managed to put a gun to their head and pull the trigger, it would feel like it took hours for the bullet to get down the barrel into their skull. And as I said there, it's a pretty graphic image, but a reminder that any smart creature trying to self-upgrade needs to worry about all the ways that might go terribly wrong, including unpredictable existential ones where simply being smarter might drive you insane. In this case, you won't need a bullet, your brain produces heat when flipping switches or thinking. We already pushed the limits on what our body can handle for cooling our brain, so spiking that up a millionfold, which would be cramming a 10 megawatt power plant into your head, would cause it to ignite, instantly incinerating your head. Though from your perspective, it might be a rather slow process. And everything near it would burn too. Your head is about 1/10 of a square meter in surface area, so that would be a surface power output of 100 megawatts a square meter, which is more radiation output than the surface of the sun, which runs about 67 megawatts a square meter. So not a good game plan, and as we'll see when we get to Matrioshka brains, which run on stars, they focus on being large and staging that temperature down by spreading it out, which of course slows computation down. And you might be thinking that this is just because our meat brain isn't very efficient. Modern computers are better than they've ever been before, especially compared to in the 1990s, when most of the speculation was getting going in depth, and as I mentioned, they use way more energy and produce way more heat than our brain does. Thought for thought. Now, a personal computer in the 90s needed about the same power supply and cooling efforts as nowadays, while being thousands of times less powerful, so we can assume computers would get faster and use less energy to do the same work. But that's a fairly dubious handwave, and indeed one limited by the temperature around it. We call this Landauer's limit, and it shows that the cooler you are, the less energy it takes to do the same calculation. 1/10 the temperature, 1/10 the energy. Unfortunately, the primary limitation on heat radiation is surface area and temperature, so the smaller you make something, the less surface it can radiate heat from, and the colder something is, the less heat it radiates per moment. And this goes with the fourth power, so something 10 times hotter radiates heat off at 10 to the fourth times the rate, 10,000. And vice versa, if an object has cooled to 1/10 the temperature, it is cooling 10,000 times slower than before. That next degree of temperature doesn't take an hour to drop, but a whole year. So if you imagine a 2D chip built 1/10 as wide, and designed to run at 1/10 the temperature, it has 100 times less surface area to radiate 10,000 times slower from, and now needs 1,000,000 times as long between flipping each switch to cool back down for the next flip or thought. Very power efficient, but not very fast. Henson was aware of this when he suggested a Jupiter brain, and the J-brain thought experiment is about using that much mass to make a supermind, not something that specific size. Jupiter is on an order of 2 billion times more massive than our brains, so even if it were just one big meat brain like ours, it would be pretty impressive to say the least. Pretty hot too. Our brains run on something like 10 watts a kilogram, so a Jupiter brain that matched that would be producing 20 billion watts of waste heat, and that would be 50 times more heat or power than the sun gave off, and thus would need to be even bigger than a Dyson sphere to radiate that heat off at normal human temperature scales. A modern computer of similar processing speed would need to be even bigger, since they do more heat per unit of mass than our brains do, and from the 1990s would need an even bigger radiating shell to avoid burning up. We often imagine godlike intelligences, Jupiter brains, and planet-sized processors, capable of solving problems we can barely comprehend. But here on Earth, even a smaller scale idea can have real impact if you got the right tools to bring it to life. Enter Hosting Your Horizons, your all-in-one AI partner who can take your ideas and instantly turn them into a real, working website or web app. No code, no waiting, no frustration. You just describe your project and Horizons builds it for you. Layout, copy, functionality, all fully editable, mobile-friendly, and ready to launch in minutes. We talk a lot about K2 sieves and Dyson swarms, and our Megaminds are an example of that. So I used Hosting Your Horizons to generate a website for calculating the populations of one based on star brightness, degree of enclosure, and what the energy was being used for. And with that simple prompt, it got us a solid K2 tracker and interface that with just a couple minor tweaks was ready to go. Whether you're building an MVP, a client portfolio, or your personal passion project, Horizons is optimized for performance and backed by Hosting Your's global infrastructure. That means fast hosting, export support, and built-in SEO to help your big idea punch above its weight. Because you don't need to build a Jupiter brain to launch something amazing, you just need the right platform. Try Hosting Your Horizons today, and use code IsaacArthur to get 10% off. Your next big idea is just a few keystrokes away. This is what we see in the Matrioshka brain, which is an enormous and thin stellar engine, though not the reason for its name. We could just call it a star brain or stellar computer or stellar engine focused on computation, but it works on the idea that you can generally recycle waste heat of something hotter with something cooler. This is how heat engines work, or produce work, and basically how all power production does too. The sunlight coming off our own sun is waste heat, coming up from fusion reactions deep in the core that is far hotter, and all that energy lands on Earth and radiates away at a new, lower frequency, roughly at our room temperature or outdoor temperature anyway, more in the infrared range. We can't use that for energy here, but someone in a colder place could absorb it and do work, or produce power or computation or thought. So if we built a shell around the sun, absorbing its power to run a computer, we could get a lot of computing done, of course. How much depends on how cold our computers are and what temperature we're at. Again, the same computer design can theoretically do more computing when colder. When that computer is done, that first shell, all that work of computation radiates off as heat, and another bigger and colder shell beyond could absorb that energy, just as we do with solar panels or solar thermal generators from the sun, and presumably in that first shell. It could then do some more work and at a lower temperature, and radiate that to be absorbed by another layer, and so on. This is the Matrioshka part of the name. It's a shell inside a shell inside a shell, like the Russian dolls of that name, but it's a stellar engine or stellar computer by default. It could be multiple stars or some other power source too. This isn't the scale of the device giving the name, but rather its layout. Loosely speaking, the way heat engines work, you want your cold reservoir to be at least half the absolute temperature of the hot reservoir. So for ease of contemplation, we would assume you would do one layer per half or doubling increment of temperature. In heat radiation terms, since each layer must emit the same power as the one before it, they are just recycling power. The surface area has to increase by the proportion of that temperature drop, which again goes as the fourth power. So half the temperature and you get a 16th the power output per surface area, and that means your next layer needs to be 16 times the surface area as the prior one, and the surface goes the square radius so it would be 4 times wider. If we imagine some layers out from the sun at 6000 Kelvin for the sun, then 3000 for layer 1, 1500 for layer 2, 750 for 3, 375 for 4, which is just a bit warmer than Earth, then 188 Kelvin for layer 5, which is almost the record for coldest temperature ever recorded on Earth, then 94 Kelvin for layer 6, and a Pluto-like 47 Kelvin for layer 7. In terms of radius for each shell, We have 1 solar radii for the Sun, 4 solar radii or SR for that first layer, then 16 for 2, 64 for 3, 256 for 4, 1024 for layer 5, 4096 SR for layer 6, and layer 7 is 16,384 times wider than our Sun, or about 75 AU. For a nominal final layer, around 1,000 times cooler than the Sun and just about double the cosmic microwave background radiation, around 6 Kelvin, that would be layer 10 at 4,800 AU, and it should be noted that if these are operating at the Landauer limit, each layer is producing twice as much computation as the one inside or down from it. The Sun is down and in the basement, and the upper layer is producing 1,024 times more computation than the inner layer, and in fact each new layer is producing the same computation as all the layers below it combined. Assuming you need the same material to build each chunk of area per layer, each new layer is also taking 16 times more matter than the next layer below it too. So matter used per computer switch is rising sharply even compared to gains made in efficiency. Now in practice, there's not likely to be any physical layers, you just have a huge cloud of power collectors and computers and transmitters orbiting your star as a huge swarm, and whatever distance a given satellite is from that star, they absorb power and turn into computation and more waste heat, but it will resemble this object's effective function. It's just an irony that the name is so memorable and specific to many layers, but in practice would just be a Dyson cloud, and quite probably with non-computing bits in it too, maybe even space habitats, not big discrete layers as the word Matrioshka implies. Same, a Jupiter brain is just arbitrarily a computer of large planetary mass, as we already saw, and as we already saw, it wouldn't be of that size if it was that mass. We tend to assume Dyson swarms are huge collections of multi-purpose and diverse megastructures, more like a city full of buildings than a building itself, or more like organs and cells in a body, which if we're imagining an immense brain, we might think of that star and those other structures as the body or ecosystem supporting and fueling it. In practice, a habitation-focused Dyson swarm is going to have a ton of computers in it too, even if it's mostly focused on biology, but a post-human civilization might be all computers instead of biology, and those various satellite nodes just run individual people's emulated brains, or whole communities of them. That's one way we get around the speed issue of our really big brain that might need to wait hours between when signals arrive from across its wider surface. We simply don't have one in favor of brains built more to the human timescales and abilities. This episode isn't really about what else we might do with Dyson swarms, but given the limitations on computing at the higher temperature, I generally assume the inner layers are used for a lot of mass manufacturing and power collection, and that you have a habitat layer for biologicals out at the more terrestrial distances normally envisioned for a Dyson swarm. And then beyond that, we start seeing the huge computational layers, where they work better anyway. At least for power per unit of thought or calculation. You might want to build a huge M-brain around a supergiant star, knowing it was inefficient watt for watt, and that the whole thing was going to explode in a million years, but if your goal is solving a problem, speed does matter. We could even imagine something like a brain bomb that was a single-use computer fueled by a nuke, which conveniently gets around the potential issue of it becoming sentient and murdering you all off, since it might well do that but can't really evade its fate an instant after awareness. When contemplating the immense and unknowable powers of a greater mind, we do need to avoid simply assuming magic abilities. The smartest computer in the world can't beat me at tic-tac-toe, because it has a finite number of moves and you can always force a draw. And you can have an IQ of 202 and you're still screwed if you look up and see an ICBM is about to land in front of you a tenth of a second from now. So there would tend to be an assumption that an M-brain can be continuously scaled up. We see the K2 version by default, but that could go to K3 galaxy-wide or beyond. For that matter, K2 or Kardashev scale 2 is a very big category, as stars give off power at less than 1,000th the rate our own sun does, to more than 1,000,000 times the power output. Ironically, those red dwarfs on the small side are your best ones for total calculation per unit mass, or total thoughts, or for post-human creatures, total effective lifespan, since that probably is getting measured as rate of thinking. After all, if I think and experience twice as fast, I get twice the living in the same time period, And if I think 100 times slower but can do it for 10,000 times as long, because I do it 100 times more efficiently too, my subjective existence is still 100 times longer. Spreading way out not only makes you more efficient but helps protect you from attacks and disasters in many ways too. You're just a huge gossamer web, maybe with whole active civilizations inside you and unaware you're up to much. We see something like this with the Spirit of the Air, a post-human intellect in Alastair Reynolds' House of Suns that was a human millions of years before who tinkered with his own brain a lot, always focused on more computational power and being safe and left alone to contemplate his thoughts. What those are, we don't really get to know, beyond it eventually taking an active role in the story, which is probably one of the best sci-fi stories ever told, so check it out. A single immense mind, dense or distributed thinly, has a lot of problems with signal lag to address that one broken-to-me smaller local minds doesn't have, and there are no magic handwaves for fixing this short of FTL, but some approaches are to have a lot of local processing units or limited subminds that make decisions and take actions independently. You could think of this like the reflexive system of a human, or the way we tend to build human hierarchies for large organizations. These might even be human intelligent or superintelligent, as if the megamind at the top is still vastly smarter, it isn't likely to be or feel threatened by its bits and pieces. All of its local processing units and regional coordinators, probably with many layers and whole ecosystems of them for different jobs, might be entirely capable of having fast and meaningful dialogue with you or I, if we arrive to chat, but the wider mind at the global synchronization scale, or stellar synchronization scale, it's not, in its entirety, even aware of us yet. I hesitate to call it a hive mind either, as it isn't necessarily any more of one than you or I are, though realistically an individual human being is often better thought of as a colony organism, particularly as we have tons of systems in our body that rely on tiny organisms utterly adapted to us and helping run our system that share none of our DNA, and we could see parallels in such a mind and its equivalent to a body too. You may have such hierarchies for self-defense running all the way up some army organization chart, from local soldiers who are very fast to react, to smarter captains who are slower to react but can coordinate a large battlefront, all the way up to some general or admiral equivalent who's in play at the very high and slow strategic level, and other areas of interest like logistics or working on smaller chunks of big problems, either under that same hierarchy or a completely different one, like a different department in the cabinet of your mind, complete with liaison minds between those departments and even rivalries about suggested advice or priorities. So this lets you have a bigger mind but retains many disadvantages, and you are vulnerable to your subminds getting treacherous or crazy. In the face of this, and knowledge that every additional widening makes you end up with more submind layers and maybe whole new departments, you might find yourself saying no to further expansion. We'll talk about this more next week in our look at the Fermi Paradox and migration, to consider if a mind might expand itself beyond one star in cases like star clusters or the galactic core. We'll talk subminds and hierarchy more in our upcoming Battle Fleets episode, and unless you're watching this when it aired on Nebula in 2024, both those episodes should already be out. Star clusters are tricky since that vastly lowers distances between stars but exacerbates heat management issues too. If adding 10 stars into your mind instead of 1 gives you 10 times the power to work with, but forces you to either work at higher temperatures or much wider radiating distances, you might decide it isn't a net value. Especially if you do have to worry about the sorts of quasi-mental or quasi-political problems of an entity whose own mind is composed of lots of disparate bits and pieces of superhuman intellects themselves. We should not take for granted that Landauer's limit is the practical limit on computation efficiency either. We might be able to somehow do better, but more likely we'll find a practical limit lower than that, which may be less temperature dependent and encourage higher temperature calculations as a result, though probably still subarctic. Scaling up a single immense mind, while it can take advantage of keeping most calculations local for individual bits, still slows as it gets bigger, and still has to adjust its power supply to maintain temperature. The computer that needed to be 100 AU wide to run efficiently needs to be 1,000,000 times wider to be 1,000,000,000,000 times smarter, and its thoughts at the global scale are taking 1,000,000 times longer to occur, however immense they are. I don't think that would ever be practical inside a galaxy, and is part of the idea behind rim migration that we'll cover next week, or again, covered last year if you're catching this episode when it comes off of Nebula onto YouTube or other platforms. Anyway, if you do need to worry about others interfering with you, then this approach is fine if you hoarded all your resources in your galaxy and are trickling them out as computation as time goes by, and we enter a post-stellar era in several trillion years. But trying to stage this up to multiple galaxies and the like is getting more dubious. For one thing, at a certain scale, you have to fight Hubble expansion from dark energy. A M-brain of Kardashev 3 scale, which we will call a galaxy brain or G-brain, is running at roughly 11 orders of magnitude more power output than our Sun, meaning it needs a radius about 300,000 times what a 10-layer K2 M-brain needs, about 1.5 billion astronomical units, or about 24,000 light-years, roughly our own distance from the galactic core, and a very slow rate of thought. If you were to kick that up another 10 orders of magnitude to a hypothetical K4 output, a supercluster or S-brain, you are now 2.4 billion light-years in radius, and your far edges are expanding apart from each other at 35% of light speed. If you can find a way around light speed, this problem goes away, which is where ideas like hyperspace computing can come in, and we could even contemplate multiverse brains, unimaginably massive minds oozing across realities for good or ill. We can also imagine how that might go ill, but we might want to ask what the hypothetical good is, and that comes back to the idea of why you build a computer so big. If your goal is to create subverses, the simulated computer kind or some other higher tech approach, then this works fine, but you don't really need a single big computer there, just some network to allow communication, because you've got endless minds running on various computers, and those folks presumably want to occasionally exchange notes. For some scale here, we probably do not need more than 10 to the 16th Hz of processing power to emulate a human mind, and even if we never do better than 10 watts a person, our Sun ought to be able to run 40 trillion people on that. We do anticipate computers close to the Landau limit being able to push that up several orders of magnitude, maybe even a trillion-fold more, so even if you had a trillion individual nodes spread out for heat dissipation, that still means entire planetary populations living within less than a light second of communication time to each other, and more rising with the square of that time lag, so that if you wanted to wait 10 seconds for a reply from someone, you get 100 times as many people, or emulated planets, inside that window. Even very superhuman minds or Gestalt consciousnesses, like hive minds, really can still operate in the many trillions without needing to go beyond the basic K2 M-brain scale. We can always come up with a reason to go bigger, I imagine, for an individual mind, but I'm not actually thinking the overriding goal of most superintelligent entities is to get just a bit smarter. In many ways, such radical alteration to something as fundamental as your intelligence is akin to suicide. Something better might result that's debatable, but it isn't really you. Gradual slow improvement might maintain that, but is arguably a hand wave. We could ask what the point of a single bigger mind or computer really is, and we are arguably hand-waving to assume it is to answer the deep question of life, the universe, and everything, especially as if it requires such a vastly more immense mind to figure it out. Odds are good the answer will be as uselessly arcane to you or I as 42 is. It's realistically about how many digits of pi are useful to know, too. At that many significant digits of accuracy, even a circle the size of our whole observable universe can be accurately inscribed down to the subatomic scale, where the haziness of the uncertainty principle is going to render further positional accuracy worthless anyway. Every so often we hear about some new computer succeeding in calculating the gajillionth unit of pi, and I have never heard of an even vaguely decent reason to justify the expense of building and running those machines beyond simply testing their general computation for other uses. You go build a megamind for the purpose of calculating something like that to some insane number of digits, and your neighbors might object to you wasting the energy and resources that could be used for making more habitats or virtual environments for people to live in, or needlessly creating the hazard of new potential godlings unleashed on the universe and obsessed with getting ever more computational power for calculating pi. This would seem to apply to most suggested computational uses I've heard for problem solving, scientific or existential. If there's not a plausible and apparent gain to be had by doing it, you're not likely to throw galactic resources at trying. It's not a winning game, and again, I really doubt any existential problem that requires computers even bigger than entire planets to solve is ever going to yield an answer we could even understand as our current selves. That doesn't mean folks might not do it, of course, but I think they'd be more likely to make their own mind bigger to become a Jupiter brain or M-brain, rather than want one commissioned. I'm also not sure anyone sane is really going to want to jump on the eternal expanding intelligence wagon, as it seems to have some pitfalls, but sanity is arguably relative, and also not terribly prerequisite for that sort of experimentation anyway. It's a good question to wrap up on, though. Would you choose to become a star-spanning intelligence if you could? And if so, why? And if not, why not? And on that note, thanks again for joining us for another SFIA exclusive here on Nebula.